Every night at exactly 3:12 a.m., he appears, a man with no face, standing perfectly still in my doorway, silent, patient, waiting for me to finally break. At first, I thought he was a nightmare. Then I realized nightmares don't leave footprints on your floorboards or lean closer when you pretend to sleep. This is the story of what he did to me, how he learned my name, and why, if you're hearing this, you must never look directly at the doorway when the clock hits 3:12, because once he knows you've seen him, he comes closer.
Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. The doorway is not empty. The nights had grown strangely heavy in the small apartment, an oppressive kind of stillness, as if the air itself were waiting for something to happen. Ethan noticed it long before he admitted anything was wrong, long before the first time he saw the silhouette. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of night that felt like it shouldn't matter. He had fallen asleep with the bedside lamp still glowing faintly, its light too dim to be comforting, too bright to let him fully rest. Hours slipped by without meaning. His dreams were shapeless, colorless, until his breathing faltered and his eyes fluttered open for no reason at all. 3:12 a.m. The red digits glared at him, sharp as a warning. And that was when he saw it, the figure in the doorway. At first, he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The shape was tall, impossibly still, a human outline cut cleanly against the deeper darkness of the hall. It stood with perfect posture, as if carved from shadow. Its head faced him, or seemed to. There were no features, no glint of eyes, nor curve of a mouth. Just a void, sculpted into a man's form. Ethan's heart beat once, hard. Then again, louder. The silence pressed against him, smothering, watchful. He whispered to himself, almost too quietly to hear, "The doorway is not empty." The words felt absurd even as he said them, but they grounded him, gave shape to what he was seeing. And yet the figure didn't react. It didn't step inside or retreat. It didn't breathe. It simply occupied the doorway as if it had always belonged there. Seconds dragged into minutes. His rational mind clawed desperately for explanations. It's sleep paralysis. You're dreaming. Your eyes are playing tricks on you. But when he moved, slowly, deliberately, his limbs responded. His fingers curled into the blankets, his breath fogged in the cold air. He was awake, entirely, painfully awake. And the figure did not vanish. Eventually, exhaustion pulled him under. Not sleep exactly, just a dimming of consciousness he couldn't fight. When he woke again, the sun was rising, spilling gentle warmth across the room. The doorway was empty. For a moment, he convinced himself the night had been a hallucination, a byproduct of stress, overwork, isolation. He laughed about it as he got ready for the day, too loudly, too forced. But the echo of fear lingered in his bones, a tremor beneath the skin. He avoided looking at the doorway for the rest of the morning. That night, he made sure to sleep early. Lights off, curtains drawn, doors closed. He wanted normalcy. He wanted silence. But when exhaustion finally dragged him into uneasy sleep, the world once again tore him awake at the same moment. 3:12 a.m. His eyes snapped open, not to a sound, not to movement, but to a presence. The figure was there again, exactly where it had been the night before, standing in the doorway like a sentinel carved from darkness. Ethan's throat tightened. He sat up slowly, as if sudden movement might provoke it. The light from the street lamps outside spilled faintly through the blinds, tracing thin silver lines across the figure's body. They didn't illuminate it. They simply vanished into its surface, swallowed whole. He whispered again, trembling. "The doorway is not empty." The words came easier this time, almost instinctive, a mantra, a confirmation, a warning. He stared for a long time, waiting for the nightmare logic to break, for the figure to dissolve like fog. But it remained as solid, as still, as impossibly present as the night before. He didn't sleep again until morning crept into the room. By the third night, fear had curdled into a strange, stubborn determination. He set his phone on the dresser, camera aimed directly at the doorway. The screen glowed faintly, capturing grainy darkness. "This is stupid," he whispered to himself, but his hands were cold. He slid under the covers and waited for sleep. When it came, it was thin and fragile, a surface-level haze, a fragile drift. And then, 3:12 a.m. His eyes flew open before the alarm he hadn't set. His breath caught in his chest, a reflex of instinctive dread. The figure was there again, exactly where it had been the night before, standing in the doorway like a sentinel carved from darkness. Ethan's throat tightened. He sat up slowly, as if sudden movement might provoke it. The light from the street lamps outside spilled faintly through the blinds, tracing thin silver lines across the figure's body. They didn't illuminate it. They simply vanished into its surface, swallowed whole. He whispered again, this time to face it. "The doorway is not empty." But it never had been.
Chapter 2.
Chapter 2. You're not supposed to waken at 3:12 a.m. The next few nights blurred together into something that barely resembled sleep. Ethan drifted, but he didn't rest. He lay still, waiting for the inevitable moment he would be ripped awake again. And though he told himself it was just anticipation, just nerves, he knew deep down that something else was doing it. Something was pulling him up from sleep like a hand gripping the back of his neck. And when his eyes cracked open, when the darkness met him like a silent, watching thing, 3:12 a.m. Every time, without fail. That number began carving itself into his mind, repeating long after the nights were over, lingering through the mornings like a phantom thought. Over breakfast, over work, over the mundane rhythm of the days he tried to keep normal, the truth haunted him. 3:12 is not an accident. The first few times, he chalked it up to coincidence, internal clock, maybe anxiety. Maybe he just thought he saw the same 3 digits because he expected to. But expectation didn't explain the precision. Expectation didn't explain the coldness of the air when he woke. Expectation didn't explain the figure standing in the doorway. And it certainly didn't explain the way the air changed before he opened his eyes. It always began the same way, a sinking heaviness across his chest, as if someone had placed a cold stone directly over his lungs. He would half dream, half drown in this thick pressure, unable to tell where his body ended and the darkness began. Then a whisper, so faint it might have been air or fabric
or breath against the wall would drift across the room. That whisper was always behind him, always near the head of the bed, always timed perfectly to pull him up into waking. And when he finally surfaced, gasping softly, the first thing he would see was the clock. 3:12 a.m., glowing like a brand on metal. He began to dread the nights long before they arrived. On the fifth night, something new happened. The cold was sharper, almost cruel. It pooled at the foot of the bed like water from a broken pipe, then crawled up the blankets, creeping into his muscles. The pressure on his lungs tightened, not enough to suffocate him, but just enough to remind him that whatever force pulled him awake could also take breath away. The whisper behind the walls was louder that night, a soft, rhythmic hum, like someone murmuring a lullaby beneath their breath. It wasn't quite a voice, not with words at least, but it held intention, pattern, purpose. He woke with a sharp inhale, heart hammering so loudly he thought the figure might react to the sound. And of course, it was there. Unmoving, unblinking, rooted to the doorway like a shadow carved into the world. Ethan didn't speak this time. He didn't whisper the mantra that had become habit. He didn't dare to breathe too deeply. He simply stared, paralyzed until the figure blurred and doubled from tears gathering in his eyes. Seconds stretched, minutes. The cold deepened. The whispering continued. When morning finally came, his voice was hoarse from not using it. He lasted a few days like that, half sleeping, half watching, trapped in a cycle of dread that felt like it had existed forever. Until finally, when exhaustion outweighed fear, Ethan acted. He opened his laptop. The search history had been wiped clean that morning. He didn't remember doing it. Maybe he hadn't. But he forced himself to start typing anyway, fingers trembling over the keys. Why do I wake up at the same time every night? What is happening at 3:12? Sleep disturbances at exact times. Unknown figures in doorways. He scrolled through articles about REM cycles, circadian disruptions, stress, all logical, all useless. But the deeper he went, the darker the results became. Posts buried in forums from a decade ago, archived threads with no replies, old paranormal blogs abandoned without updates. And the phrase kept appearing, again and again, from strangers who never met each other. I always wake up at 3:12 a.m. Not 3 o'clock, not 3:33, not the so-called witching hour times people tossed around in ghost discussions. Always 3:12. Some described a coldness, some described pressure on their chest, some described a hum behind the walls, and a few described something else, something Ethan had not yet seen in the doorway. Movement. One post stopped him cold. The user had typed only a few lines as if rushing or terrified or unwilling to say more. If you wake up at 3:12, don't look immediately at the doorway. Give it time to settle. Another post was worse, half a warning, half a confession. It learns your timing. It learns your breathing. That's when it gets closer. But the final post he found, the one that froze him completely, contained only a single sentence. They all wake up at 3:12 before they disappear. He clicked the username. The account was deleted. The profile picture was gone. Every post they'd ever made had vanished. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. His palms grew slick. The cold he felt every night seemed to leak into the room even now, in daylight. He whispered to himself, voice trembling, 312 is not an accident. He closed the laptop. But the pressure in his chest never left, not even when he stood up, paced, breathed deep, or tried to shake off the dread. Because, for the first time, Ethan understood something. Something bigger than the doorway, bigger than the figure, bigger than fear itself. Whatever woke him at 312 did not wake him alone. Hours passed, though outside the night stayed the same. And when Ethan finally drifted into uneasy, fragile sleep, he knew with absolute certainty that the morning would not save him, because the whisper behind the walls was louder now, and the figure in the doorway was learning him.
Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. He appears when you pretend not to see him. The nights grew heavier after Ethan's research. Not darker, darkness he could handle, but heavier, like a weight pressed into the walls, thickening the air until every breath felt like it had to push through something unseen. He tried staying awake, tried fighting the pull toward 3:12 a.m., but exhaustion is a patient predator, and it took him easily. Hours passed, though outside the night stayed the same. And when he woke, because of course he woke, the crimson glow of the digital clock met him like an accusation. 3:12 a.m. The figure stood in the doorway, exactly where it always was. Only tonight, Ethan didn't stare back immediately. He had a theory now, fragile, reckless, desperate, and he wanted to test it. So instead of sitting up and acknowledging the silhouette, he forced his breathing to steady, forced his muscles to stay loose, forced his eyes to remain barely open, slitted just enough to see the blur of the doorway. He pretended to sleep. The seconds stretched. The air chilled. The whispering behind the walls trembled, softening to a faint pulse. And in that claustrophobic stillness, he repeated the words silently. He moves when you don't look. At first, nothing changed. The figure was still stone, still shadow, still absence carved into a man's shape. But then, the floorboard nearest the doorway groaned. A slow, stretching creak. Not loud, not even deliberate sounding. Just weight shifting. Ethan's heart seized. He didn't move, didn't breathe more than a shallow whisper. He kept his eyelids low, just barely enough to catch any change in the figure's outline. And there it was. The silhouette had leaned forward. Not much, just a fraction, an unnatural tilt, as though someone had taken the top half of a human form and pulled it a few degrees closer to him. A silent, impossible invitation. A confirmation. Ethan nearly bolted upright, but another slow, deliberate creak rooted him in place. The figure hadn't stepped. It didn't need to. Its presence alone shifted the air in the room. Thicker, colder, charged like the edge of a storm. His pulse raced so violently he feared it would betray him. He moves when you don't look. The truth repeated itself with every passing second. The realization slithered under his skin, burrowing deep. The figure wasn't just appearing. It wasn't just watching. It was reacting. It knew when he was awake. It knew when he was aware. It knew when he pretended not to see. When morning light finally seeped into the room, washing over the doorway like a thaw, Ethan sat up with a gasp, half a sob, half a breath. only to find the figure gone once more. His first instinct was to run, leave the apartment, sleep in the car, find somewhere, anywhere that didn't have a doorway waiting for him. But dread anchored him. Not fear, something worse. Curiosity. Because now he needed to know how much it could move, and why it chose not to when he was watching. That night, he prepared differently. He removed the batteries from the smoke detector, the one that always chirped once at sunrise, as if mocking him. He unplugged the hallway lamp so no stray light would distort the silhouette. And he set his phone to record again, not just video this time, but audio with the gain turned to maximum. He wanted proof. He wanted answers. He wanted to understand the rules of the thing in his doorway. He lay in bed and waited, hours passing slowly, though the world outside remained frozen in perpetual midnight. His breathing slowed, heart steadying rhythmically like he was preparing for surgery, not sleep. When unconsciousness came, it wasn't gentle. It was a drop, a fall into darkness. But waking was worse. He surfaced instantly, violently, like someone yanked him upward by the spine. 3:12 a.m. The figure was there, but this time Ethan didn't pretend to sleep right away. He looked straight at it for a long moment, meeting the absence where eyes should be. For a split second, the cold intensified, sharp, crystalline, like the figure recognized the acknowledgement. Then Ethan let his eyelids droop, slower this time, controlled, intentional, pretending. Within seconds, the first creak came. The figure shifted again. Another inch forward, another unnatural lean. He moves when you don't look. The mantra pulsed through him with every breath he struggled to contain. Then, a second creak. Closer, lower, heavier. Ethan's fingertips curled into the blanket. His throat tightened as he fought the instinct to sit up, scream, run, anything except lie still. The air felt colder than any winter he'd lived through. It seeped into his bones, numbed his fingers, pulled at the warmth around his heart like a vacuum. Then, a breath. Not Ethan's, not the building's, not something natural or living. A hollow, dragging exhale drifted across the room from the figure's direction. It carried the smell of damp soil and rotting leaves, earth that had been disturbed, moved, unsettled. He almost broke then, almost opened his eyes wide, almost gasped. But he held steady. Barely. And the figure rewarded him with the sound he feared most. A third creak. So close now he could feel the vibration through the floorboards. He didn't need to open his eyes to know. The figure had stepped forward this time. When dawn finally came, it was weak, as if the sun itself hesitated to enter the room. Ethan sat up slowly, trembling violently, muscles stiff from hours of fear-frozen tension. He forced himself to turn on the phone recording. The audio played back softly at first. Silence. A hum. His breathing. Then, the creak. Then another. Then another, followed by a low, unnatural exhale that warbled through the microphone like static wrapped in a human shape. Proof. Evidence. A pattern. His fear was no longer abstract. He shut off the phone and whispered to himself, hollow and shaking, "He moves when you don't look." And then, softer, breaking, "He's getting closer." But the worst truth waited just beyond that revelation. Something deeper. Something he didn't want to accept. The figure didn't move to frighten him. It moved because Ethan allowed it to. Avoidance wasn't protection. Avoidance was invitation. The less he acknowledged the figure, the more it came forward, and it wasn't finished yet.
Chapter 4. Chapter 4. The house remembers what you fear. By the time the fourth week arrived, Ethan no longer trusted the layout of his own home. The apartment had always been small. 2 bedrooms, a narrow hallway connecting them, creaking wood floors worn by decades of tenants. It should have felt familiar, comforting even. But lately, the air within those walls carried a strange elasticity, as if the structure itself was loosening around him. It began subtly. One morning, he stepped out of his bedroom and paused. The hallway looked the same, but something was off. An uncanny shift he couldn't articulate. It felt longer, as if the opposite wall had been pulled back a few inches, just enough to disrupt his sense of distance. He blinked, looked again. The hallway returned to normal, but the unease remained whispering beneath the surface. The house remembers. The phrase slipped into his thoughts uninvited, like someone had leaned close enough to murmur it directly into his ear. Hours passed, though outside the day shifted from dull gray to darker shades of evening. Ethan tried to distract himself. Work, coffee, music, but whenever he walked through the apartment, his steps felt mismatched to the floor. Too long, too short, like the boards repositioned themselves just to confuse him. He first noticed the object displacement that night. His bedroom lamp, a simple glass fixture, wasn't where he left it. It sat on the opposite side of the nightstand, tilted just slightly, casting an unfamiliar angle of light across the bed. He frowned. Had he moved it? Maybe. Probably. But when he turned away, something cold pressed into his spine. A realization that the lamp hadn't just moved. Its cord had stretched farther than before, farther than it should have reached, as if the outlet had shifted closer overnight. His breath hitched. The house remembers. The phrase repeated again, stronger this time, unfurling through the darkness like a warning or a taunt. Sleep felt impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he sensed walls leaning nearer, the ceiling lowering by fractions, the doorway stretching wider, swallowing more of the room's shape. But exhaustion eventually forced him under. Dreams came immediately. Not abstract, not surreal. Memories. He saw himself as a boy, 8 years old, running down a narrow hallway in his childhood home. The walls were darker there, wallpaper peeling in long strips, the floorboards groaning under his frantic footsteps. And behind him, shadows followed. Familiar ones. Nightmares he thought he had outgrown. Tall silhouettes with no limbs. Figures bending at impossible angles. Faces melted smooth. Mouths that opened too wide and too slowly. He had forgotten these fears. Years buried them under logic, adulthood, false certainty. But the house hadn't. It showed them to him with perfect clarity. The house remembers. The whisper echoed through the dream. No, through the walls, like breath drifting from a place too close to ignore. Ethan woke with a gasp, drenched in cold sweat. The room smelled faintly of damp soil and old wallpaper glue, as if a piece of his childhood home had been transplanted into the present. He wiped his forehead and froze. Across the hallway, the guest bedroom door was cracked open. He hadn't opened it in weeks. He approached slowly, each step a quiet negotiation with dread. The door, crooked in its frame, creaked as he pushed it open. The room inside was empty. And yet, not. Shadows clung to the corners differently tonight, pooling in wide, familiar shapes, ones he recognized from childhood, ones he prayed had been nothing but imagination. He stepped forward, and the shadows shifted. His heart slammed against his ribs, but the darkness didn't move toward him. It simply rippled, as though reacting to his presence, as though it remembered the shape of his childhood terror. His throat tightened. The house remembers. The whisper drifted through the room again, subtle, almost tender, but unmistakable. Ethan backed out, breathing hard, gripping the doorknob so tightly his knuckles whitened. The hallway behind him seemed longer again. Too long, as if the house was stretching its limbs. By morning, he found something new. Something worse. On the wall near the doorway of his bedroom, faint scorch marks marred the paint. At first glance, they looked like smudged soot or the remnants of a candle burn. But when he leaned closer, the shape sharpened. A handprint. Fingers splayed. Palm pressed flat. Burned into the wall as if someone or something had tried to steady itself there. His breath quivered. He reached out, tracing the edges without touching them fully, afraid the surface might still be warm. It wasn't. It was ice cold. And that wasn't the worst part. The handprint. It was his. Not just similar. Precise. The long middle finger he'd broken in high school football, the slight curve from childhood fractures, even the length of the palm. Unmistakable. He jerked his hand back, trembling violently. This wasn't possible. He never touched the wall. He never burned anything. He never... Unless the house was showing him something he didn't remember. Something he didn't want to. The whisper rolled through his mind, no longer subtle. The house remembers. The scorch marks seemed to darken under the morning light, or maybe Ethan's vision sharpened in panic. Either way, the truth anchored itself cruelly. This wasn't random. This wasn't the figure mimicking him. This wasn't coincidence. The house was responding to him. His fears, his memories, his past. And it was becoming something shaped by them. Something alive. That night, he tried to sleep in the living room. He lasted 20 minutes before the shadows on the wall began stretching toward him, slow, reaching tendrils forming the outline of childhood nightmares. He returned to his bedroom, defeated. The scorch marks greeted him. The hallway felt longer. The lamps had shifted again. The doorway waited, impossibly dark. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands shaking, heart thrumming with dread he could no longer rationalize. The house remembered. The house watched. And as the clock neared midnight, he realized something horrifying. If the house remembered what he feared, what else was it capable of bringing back?
Chapter 5. Chapter 5. Walls should not breathe, unless something lives inside them. Ethan didn't intend to record anything that night. He was too exhausted, too fractured, too hollowed out by days of watching the hallway stretch into impossible shapes and nights spent waiting for the faceless figure to lean 1 inch closer. But his phone was still set to record from the previous night's experiment. The setting had saved itself. So when he finally collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, barely conscious, he didn't bother to turn it off. Hours passed, though outside, the night stayed the same.
When 3:12 a.m. arrived, he didn't wake. Not at first. Instead, something else stirred him. Not the heavy presence from the doorway. Not the familiar chill of the room. Not the whispering behind the walls. A sound. A soft, rhythmic pulse. Almost like breathing. Slow, deep, unmistakably alive. He lifted his head groggily, muscles trembling with fatigue, and blinked at the darkness. The figure stood in the doorway, as it always did, motionless, watching, waiting. But tonight, Ethan wasn't looking at the figure. He was listening to the walls. The plaster beside his bed expanded outward, just slightly, only to pull back in with a long, low exhale that scraped faintly across the room. Ethan froze. The walls moved again. A subtle swell, a soft contraction, a breath. He whispered before he realized he was speaking, his voice thin as thread. "The walls are breathing." The words left his lips like an admission he had been afraid to make. He slowly reached for his phone on the nightstand, hands shaking violently, and replayed the last minute of audio. There it was, clear, rhythmic, wet sounding even. A slow inhalation, a slow exhalation. The walls were breathing. Not metaphorically, not his imagination, not the settling of an old building. This was biological, intentional, alive. He pressed a trembling hand against the drywall. The surface felt strangely warm, as though heat pulsed behind it, heat that didn't belong to any electrical source or pipe. A faint vibration throbbed under his palm. He recoiled instinctively, spine colliding with the bed frame. By morning, the breathing had stopped. But something else had appeared. Brownish-black streaks seeped from the seam where the wall met the floorboards. The stains were dark and thick, with uneven edges like something had forced its way through from the other side. He crouched close, jaw clenched as the smell hit him. Wet soil, decaying leaves, and something heavier beneath it. Something metallic. Something old. Rain. But not the clean kind. The kind that dripped through underground caverns. The kind that pooled in forgotten basements. The kind that clung to bodies. He gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve. The stains weren't random. They trickled down in patterns, small branching trails that resembled veins, pulsing faintly with dried dark residue. A living thing had pushed against the wall, and the house had let it through. The hallway wasn't any better. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, curling outward as if lifted by invisible breath. The air tasted stale, heavy with humidity that hadn't been there the day before. When he stepped near the closet, a low groan trembled through the floorboards. Not from his weight, not from the wood. It echoed from inside the wall. Ethan stepped back quickly, heart hammering against his ribs. The walls inhaled again. He could hear it, not with his ears, but with his bones, a deep, resonant intake of air that rattled through the framework of the building. The house inhaled. The house exhaled. The house crawled. Something inside it shifted direction. Toward him. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands and pointed it toward the wall, recording instinctively. But the camera view didn't show the bulging he saw with his own eyes, only subtle distortions, ripples in the shadow, like heat waves trapped in the shape of something pushing forward. He lowered the phone, chest heaving. For the first time,
He understood. The figure in the doorway was not the only thing in the house. Something else lived in the walls, something older, something that breathed alongside the structure, something that remembered. The crawling inched closer, slow and methodical, until the sound pressed right behind the wall he leaned against. Then, silence. A perfect, crushing silence that made his ears ring. Ethan waited. Seconds stretched. Minutes. Hours, or maybe it only felt that way. He didn't sleep. He didn't dare. Because now that he'd heard what lived inside the walls, one truth remained. The house wasn't just remembering his fears. It was feeding on them. And something inside it was hungry.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6. He is learning your name, one breath at a time. Ethan used to think silence meant safety, but now silence meant attention, and attention meant danger. Because the house no longer whispered nonsense in the walls. It no longer hummed like an old building settling. It whispered him. The first time it happened, he nearly convinced himself it was the wind, just a breath curling through the cracked window frame. He had been sitting in the living room, lights off, gathering what little courage he had left. The apartment felt swollen with darkness, as though the building inhaled more air than Ethan did. And then the whisper floated through the room. Soft, low, an imitation of sound trying to remember how to be a voice. The breath stuttered, dragging the syllables like something tasting each one. Ethan froze. His coffee mug slipped from his hand, hitting the carpeted floor without shattering. Or maybe he just didn't hear it shatter. His ears were full of something else now. Another whisper, this one longer, closer. Not a voice, not exactly. More like something breathing his name instead of speaking it. His heart slammed violently against his ribs. His throat tightened, paralyzed between a gasp and a scream. But he did neither. He simply listened, and the room listened back. He whispered the truth to himself, the words trembling out of him like a failing incantation. He knows you now. The whispers didn't stop after that night. They changed. They grew. With each passing hour, with each breath of the living walls, the entity refined its mimicry, smoothing out the raw edges of its attempts. It was learning, adapting, practicing. The next whisper came the following evening, just after Ethan turned off the hallway light. The darkness settled over the apartment like ink, thick enough to feel. He took one step toward the bedroom, then stopped. A breath drifted through the hall. Clearer than before. Still wrong, but closer, more human. His skin crawled. He stepped backward unconsciously, giving the darkness more room to expand between him and the sound. The boards beneath him creaked, and with that brittle noise, a new whisper grew from the walls themselves. Soft, but unmistakably pleased. Ethan. This time, the pronunciation was almost perfect. In something in the way the voice formed his name, elongated, stretched, reverent, made bile rise in his throat. It wasn't just copying him. It was savoring him.
He knows you now. Hours passed, though the night stayed the same. Ethan paced the hall, pacing in circles because every direction led back to fear. The walls pulsed faintly with that unnatural rhythm, like the lungs of some enormous creature sleeping behind the plaster. "I'm imagining this," he whispered. The house disagreed. "Ethan." This time it came from the floorboards. He stumbled back, heart racing, feet tangling. His heel hit the baseboard sharply, sending shock up his calf. But that pain was nothing compared to the dread curling cold fingers into his spine. Wherever he walked, the whispers followed. Not loudly, not aggressively, just close enough to remind him that there was no corner the entity couldn't reach, no room he could claim as safe. The real discovery happened the next morning. He hadn't slept. He hadn't even pretended to. But sunlight pushed through the blinds with fragile warmth he no longer trusted. And he forced himself into motion, unable to stand the stillness of the room any longer. He walked to the bedroom doorway, stopped, stared. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. The wooden threshold was darker than usual, streaked with thin, shallow grooves. He knelt slowly, fingertips hesitating over the marks. They weren't random scratches. They weren't the work of rodents or tools or accidents. They were letters. His letters. His name. Ethan. Scratched repeatedly into the wood. Dozens of times. Hundreds of times. Some were fresh, pale against the darker grain. Others were old, weathered into the floor as though carved decades ago. His breath hitched. He leaned closer, studied the deeper carvings, traced the edges with trembling fingers. Some of them weren't carved with something. Some of them looked like carved by something. Long grooves dragged by fingers that had no business being that strong or that sharp. He recoiled so hard he hit the wall behind him. "No," he whispered. "No, I didn't do this. I didn't." But the carvings continued far beyond the fresh woodwork. His name repeated again and again into the darkened lines, looping downward toward the baseboard like an obsession, or a rehearsal, as though something had been practicing writing his name for years, as though it had been waiting for someone named Ethan to live here. His stomach twisted, his vision wavered, his hands trembled so violently that he had to grab the doorframe to steady himself. The truth was undeniable now. This thing hadn't started learning his name this week. It had been learning it for a very, very long time. "He knows you now." The phrase echoed through him like a heartbeat cracking in half. That night, he tried not to listen, but the walls were alive. Their breath came slow and steady, matching the inhale-exhale of some monstrous sleeper. And within that breath, the whisper threaded itself like a parasite. "Ethan. Ethan. 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 Ethan." Each iteration was clearer, smoother, unbearably intimate. He curled beneath his blankets, knees to chest, covering his ears, but the voice slid around his palms, seeped into the mattress springs, vibrated through the floorboards beneath him. It was inside the walls, inside the house, inside him. And just before dawn, when the sun painted faint streaks of gray against the ceiling, a final whisper brushed the air beside his bed. Not from the wall, not from the doorway, but from inches behind his head. Ethan. Spoken perfectly, softly, with ownership. Ethan sat upright in a choking gasp, tears blurring his vision, hand pressed flat over his hammering heart. The house didn't just know his name anymore. The entity didn't just mimic him anymore. He wasn't being observed. He was being claimed. And the whisper that followed, barely audible, drifting through the suffocating silence, made the terror inside him bloom fully. He knows you now.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7. The closer he stands, the more your mind isn't yours. By the 7th week, Ethan could no longer trust his mind. The world around him had begun to warp, not dramatically, not in sharp cinematic distortions, but quietly, subtly, in ways that eroded the edges of reality. The kind of shifts that made him question whether he'd simply forgotten something, or whether something was removing pieces of him. It began with missing time. A few minutes at first, 5 lost here, 10 there, minutes he could justify as distraction, fatigue, zoning out, but soon the gaps widened. Entire hours evaporating like steam on glass. He'd blink and daylight would become evening. He'd step into the kitchen and reappear in the living room without crossing the space between. He'd check the clock at 9:14, then again at 11:03, without any memory of the time between. His thoughts felt smudged, half erased. The house shifted with his perception, rearranging shadows and angles as though it were rewriting itself to match his unraveling mind. And always, the figure in the doorway stood closer. He whispered it into the dark one night, voice trembling like a candle flame caught in a draft. "He thinks inside you." The phrase tasted like someone else's words. Ethan's friends noticed the changes before he did. He hadn't told them about the figure, or the walls, or the whispers, or the endless nights of waking at 3:12 a.m. with the sensation that the room was watching him breathe. But even without the truth, they could see something was wrong. "You're different," Maria had said the last time they met for coffee, though Ethan only remembered small fragments of the conversation. Her voice, the clatter of the cup, the way she leaned forward as though studying him. He remembered blinking. He remembered opening his mouth to speak. He remembered nothing else. Later, he found a note in his pocket written in unfamiliar handwriting. "You weren't alone." He didn't know who had written it. He didn't remember speaking with anyone else. He didn't remember leaving the cafe. But the words chilled him, not because of what they implied, but because of what they confirmed. He wasn't losing time randomly. Something was taking it. And the figure in the doorway had stepped closer since then, close enough that Ethan could feel its presence like a cold draft brushing his skin. He whispered again, hands trembling. "He thinks inside you." The hallucinations began next. At first, they only appeared in reflective surfaces, a flicker of movement behind me in the bathroom mirror, the subtle outline of something tall and faceless in the glass of his microwave doorway, a shadow bending in the darkened window, not matching the silhouette his body cast. He blinked, and the reflection snapped back to normal. He exhaled, and the figure vanished from the glass. But he never felt alone. One night, while brushing his teeth, he caught the figure standing behind him in the mirror, its faceless head leaned too close to his shoulder. He whipped around. Nothing. But when he looked back at the mirror, there were fingerprints on the glass. long, stretched, distorted prints that trailed down the surface like melting wax. His fingerprints, pressed from the inside. He dropped to the floor, curling inward, breath shaking violently as dread shredded through his being. His mind wasn't misfiring. His mind was being shared, infiltrated, used. His memories began to bleed. Random childhood moments surfaced uninvited, ones he'd forgotten long ago. The smell of his mother's basement, the flicker of candlelight during a thunderstorm, the shadow that had stood at the edge of his childhood bedroom door when he was 5. A shadow he always told himself wasn't real. Now, he wasn't sure. He'd seen moments from earlier that day replay through his vision like film reels, except they weren't accurate. People's faces were blurred, their voices muffled. Sometimes, the figure in the doorway appeared in the background of these memories, as if observing scenes he hadn't witnessed originally, as if editing them, as if inserting itself. He whispered, voice cracking through terror that no longer fit inside his chest. "He thinks inside you." The walls answered with a low hum, vibrating softly, as though agreeing. By the end of the week, Ethan could no longer tell which thoughts were his. When he woke in the morning, he found sentences in his notebook, ones he had no memory of writing. "It watches what you think. You don't dream alone. Stop trying to forget. Stop trying to resist. Let him in." And worst of all was the final line. "You already did." His throat tightened, his stomach twisted. He shut the notebook and threw it across the room. But the echo of that handwriting, his handwriting, haunted him. Because deep down, beneath layers of rationality and denial, Ethan knew the truth. He hadn't been alone in his head for a long time. And then came the night he lost himself entirely. He was sitting at the edge of his bed, staring at the darkened doorway. The figure stood there, closer than ever before, so close it nearly eclipsed the doorframe. Its faceless head tilted too far to the side, as though studying him from a new angle. The room pulsed with its breath. The walls throbbed with its awareness. The air thickened with its presence. Ethan blinked just once, and suddenly he was standing. Not by choice, not through intention. His body simply moved. His legs walked him forward. His arms hung loose at his sides. His breath matched not his own rhythm, but something else's. He stepped towards the figure. One step, another, another. His mind screamed at his limbs to stop, to freeze, to run, but his body didn't obey. Something else guided him, like invisible strings pulling taut. He could feel the entity inside his thoughts now, cool, quiet, intrusive, like a second consciousness woven through his own. A whisper brushed the inside of his skull, not outside, not through the air, but inside him. Closer. He gasped, stumbled backward, collapsed beside the bed, clutching his head as though trying to hold his thoughts in place. The figure watched, silently, unmoving, patient, almost satisfied. He choked out the only truth that still belonged to him. He thinks inside you. And in the suffocating silence that followed, he felt the figure step closer, without moving at all.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. When the footsteps start, it's already too late. For weeks, Ethan had feared the figure might move. He feared the idea of its steps, long,
heavy strides shaking the floorboards, crossing the darkness with impossible speed. But fear is a strange thing. It fills the mind with imagined horrors long before the real ones arrive. And when the real ones finally do, they are always worse. Because Ethan only heard the footsteps after the presence had already entered the room. He whispered the truth, trembling beneath the blankets. You hear him too late. It began on a night saturated with silence, too still, too smooth, as if the house were holding its breath. The walls didn't hum. The figure didn't whisper his name. Even the air felt suspended, incapable of movement. Something was waiting. Hours passed, though outside the night refused to change. Ethan sat upright in bed, unable to rest, unable to blink for too long in case something used the darkness behind his eyelids to get closer. He watched the doorway carefully. The figure stood there as always, unmoving, faceless, carved from the night itself. But tonight, there was a wrongness to its stillness. The shape felt denser, heavier, as though gravity itself pulled harder around it. And then the room changed. Not visually, not audibly, but atmospherically. The temperature dropped with such sharp suddenness that Ethan's breath crystallized in the air before him. A thin fog drifted from his lips. His heart spasmed. The figure tilted its head. Only a fraction, just enough for the shadows to shift along its outline. Ethan's pulse hammered. He backed away instinctively, crawling until he wedged himself into the far corner of the room, half hidden behind his dresser. He thought the corner would protect him. He thought distance mattered. He thought watching mattered. He didn't understand that none of it mattered, at all. Because when the footsteps finally came, they came from inside the room. The first step was so soft, he mistook it for a settling floorboard. A tiny shift, a subtle weight. Then came the second. He froze. The figure in the doorway hadn't moved. It remained fixed, an unmoving pillar of shadow stretching from floor to ceiling. But the footsteps, they came from the opposite side of the room, behind him. He clamped his mouth over his hand. A third step followed, slow, deliberate, dragging slightly across the wood with the heaviness of something unused to walking. You hear him too late. The whispered mantra pulsed through his skull with each step. He squeezed himself deeper into the corner, heart slamming against his rib cage, breath trembling so violently that the air itself seemed to vibrate. The fourth step landed. Closer, much closer. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see something that shouldn't exist in a room he already feared. But humans always look. Curiosity is stronger than sanity. He turned his head by a few centimeters, just enough to see the center of the room. Nothing there. No figure, no shape, no shadow. Only darkness shifting subtly, like air displaced by something tall. A fifth step came, right in front of him. The boards trembled. His lungs convulsed. His fingers dug into the baseboard behind him until splinters pricked his skin. He whispered again, breathless, "You hear him too late." The sixth step did not land fully. It stopped partially, hovering so close he could feel cold air brush against his knees, air that smelled of damp earth and old, still water, the scent of things buried beneath soil for too long. He shut his eyes. The seventh step landed an inch from his hand. He flinched violently, biting back a cry. The floorboard groaned under the weight, bowing inward with impossible pressure. The wood splintered slightly,
tiny cracks splintering outward like branching veins. This creature, this entity, was far heavier than the figure that stood in the doorway. It was something else, something that had lived inside the breathing walls, something allowed to roam freely now, something summoned by his fear. He pressed both hands over his ears, just as... Silence. Not relief, not mercy. The kind of silence that meant something was deciding, testing him, considering. He didn't breathe for several seconds. When he finally inhaled, shallow and trembling, the breath felt stolen from someone else. The presence leaned closer. He didn't see it. He didn't hear it. He felt it. The cold intensified, wrapping around him like a second skin. The space around his body compressed subtly, as though the air was being forced aside by a shape that pressed inward, curious, intrusive. He trembled uncontrollably. You hear him too late. The phrase whispered through his mind again, louder this time. Not his voice, not the figure's whisper. Something else. Something crawling from the walls. Ethan opened his eyes and saw them. The prints. Deep impressions in the floorboards, directly in front of him. Indentations shaped like feet. But these were not human feet. They were too long, too narrow, with claw-like protrusions at the ends where toes should have been. The prints were fresh, and they were spaced exactly as the footsteps had sounded. He stared in paralyzed horror. The wood sagged inward at each print, as though something enormous had stood there moments before. And then, a final step echoed. Behind him. He jerked his head around in terror, hands clawing at the wall for leverage, but again nothing visible stood there. Only a deeper shadow, only the cold, only breath that didn't belong to him. He scrambled away from the corner, stumbling across the room, gasping, shivering uncontrollably. He reached his bed and collapsed against it, hugging his knees, fighting the urge to vomit. The footsteps were gone, but those indentations remained. Impossible, undeniable, permanent. Proof that something walked when the figure in the doorway stood still. He whispered, broken, "You hear him too late." A single breath, unmistakably not his, curled into his ear. Close, wet, hungry. Too late. He screamed. When morning finally arrived, sunlight spilled across the floor. The footprints were still there, deeper now, darkened around the edges, shaped by a creature that should not have weight, and yet carried more than any human could. Something in the walls had taken its first steps into the room, and now that it had learned how to walk, it would not stop.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 9. You can't run from a doorway that follows you. Ethan left the house at dawn. Not with a plan, not with luggage, not with the intention to return. He simply walked out the front door while the sun struggled to rise behind storm-thick clouds, gripping his car keys with trembling fingers and refusing to look back at the building that had swallowed his sleep, his sanity, and parts of his memory. The apartment wasn't safe. The walls weren't safe. The doorway was never safe. He whispered to himself, voice raw, "The doorway follows." He didn't believe it yet, but he soon would. The hotel room should have been a sanctuary. Sterile walls, bright lights, no history, no lurking shadows etched into the floorboards. Ethan checked in under a name he barely remembered, dragged himself up the elevator, and collapsed onto the unfamiliar bed. The scent of industrial detergent filled the air, sharp and clean, so different from the earthy decay that had haunted his home. For a brief moment, just a breath, he felt safe. Hours passed, though inside the stale hotel air remained perfectly still. He turned on the television just for the sound, not to watch, not to think, just to drown out the memory of the crawling in the walls, the whispers, the breathing. But eventually, exhaustion pulled him towards sleep. He shut off the lamp. The room darkened. Silence slid into the space like a tide. And then, something shifted behind him. A soft click. A subtle change in the air pressure. The unmistakable sensation of a space stretching open. He turned slowly. The bathroom door was ajar, just slightly, only an inch. But that inch was enough to reveal a dark vertical slice, perfectly black, impossibly deep. A threshold, a doorway. His heart convulsed. He stumbled backward until he hit the headboard. No, no, no! But the truth seeped into the room as steadily as the night. The doorway had followed him. Not the house, not the walls, not the creature that breathed behind them. The doorway itself, a dark threshold opening wherever he tried to rest. He shut the bathroom door with shaking hands, locked it, pushed a chair against it. But hours later, when he drifted into a fractured half-dream, the sound woke him. The door creaked open again, and the gap was wider. He fled the hotel at dawn. No shower, no checkout, no explanation. He drove until the city blurred into highways, and highways blurred into quiet streets. His vision flickered at the edges, sleep deprivation carving shadows beneath his eyes, paranoia twisting every reflection in the rearview mirror. He arrived at his friend Jacob's apartment unannounced. Jacob stared at him with startled concern. You look awful." Ethan tried to form words. Only half of them came out. "I just need a place for a night, please." Jacob frowned but nodded. He was kind, loyal, and he didn't ask many questions. Ethan collapsed onto the couch. It smelled of old leather and laundry detergent, ordinary grounding scents. He clung to them like lifelines. Jacob dimmed the lights. "Get some sleep." Ethan tried. God, he tried. But as the darkness deepened, his breath shortened. Anxiety crawled beneath his skin like ants. The ceiling above him swirled with faint shadows, shapes that seemed unfamiliar, yet chillingly intentional. He told himself he was imagining it. He told himself the doorway wouldn't appear here. Jacob was alive. Jacob's apartment was safe. Jacob's space hadn't been corrupted. But the darkness disagreed. It shifted. It deepened. It stretched. And when Ethan rolled onto his side, the kitchen entrance across the room seemed far darker than it should be. Darker than the room allowed. A silhouette stood there. Tall, still, waiting. Ethan's breath hitched. The figure wasn't in a doorway. It was the doorway. He whispered, shaking violently. "The doorway follows." Jacob snored softly in the next room.
He had no idea what stood a few feet from the man sleeping on his couch. Ethan didn't wake him. He didn't blink. He simply watched the silhouette, watched as it remained frozen in that same impossible posture, as though carved from the deepest shadow. And then the shape faded. Not disappeared, not walked away, just retreated into the dark, as if slipping between layers of reality. Ethan didn't sleep at all. The next morning, Jacob confronted him. "You kept talking in your sleep, or not talking, whispering to someone." Ethan stared blankly. Jacob frowned deeper. "You said something like, 'Don't open it.' And then you said—" He hesitated. Ethan swallowed hard. His voice cracked. "What did I say?" Jacob's expression softened into fear. "You said, 'It's already here.'" Ethan's stomach plummeted. He left before sunset. He didn't want Jacob involved, didn't want anyone else swallowed by this nightmare, because it wasn't confined to a single address anymore. It lived in the threshold of every room he entered. He tried hiding in public next. A mall, a crowded food court. He sat under the fluorescent lights, sipping coffee with trembling hands, believing, hoping that the entity wouldn't follow him somewhere so bright, so loud, so full of life. But when he stepped inside the restroom, just for a moment, the doorway found him anyway. He froze in the stall. The crack under the door darkened. A shadow stretched across the tile. A silhouette formed. Long legs, elongated torso, head that tilted too slowly. He covered his mouth. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. The doorway had opened under the stall partition. The shadow pulsed faintly, waited, listened. He whispered, tears dripping silently from his chin. "The doorway follows." A cold draft slid under the stall door, curling around his ankles with deliberate curiosity. He fled. Night fell again. He had nowhere left to run. He ended up in an abandoned parking garage, the kind that echoed footsteps into long, cavernous stretches. Concrete pillars vanished into shadows. The air smelled of oil and damp stone. Ethan sat against a pillar, chest hollow, mind unraveling. He whispered into the emptiness, "Please, stop." The garage lights flickered. Every darkened space, every shadowed opening, every stretch between pillars shifted, deepened, darkened, and dozens of doorways appeared in the gloom, every one of them watching him. Not openings, not spaces, not portals. Eyes, doorways waiting to become him. He screamed. The sound echoed endlessly, and as the echoes died, the whisper answered, not from one doorway, not from one figure, but from all of them at once. "Follows." Ethan collapsed to the cold concrete, sobbing, shaking, defeated. There was no escape. Not from the house, not from the walls, not from the entity in the threshold. Because the truth had followed him here, settling into the hollow of his mind like a final verdict. The doorway follows.
Chapter 10.
Chapter 10. The final night begins when the silence stops.
The final night began without thunder, without wind, without whispers in the walls. It began with silence so complete, so violently unnatural, that Ethan felt it before he heard it. Silence that pressed against the skin like deep water. Silence that swallowed the soft hum of electricity, the distant buzz of traffic, the creak of the world simply existing. Ethan stood in the center of the parking garage where he thought he'd hidden himself. His breath fogged faintly in the cold air. His ears strained for anything, the scuff of a shoe, the flutter of distant wings, even the whispering that had haunted him for weeks. Nothing. Just a void where sound should have lived. He whispered into it anyway. "The silence is your only warning." His voice didn't echo. It didn't even fully leave his throat. The silence consumed it instantly. He staggered back, panic blooming in his chest like frost spreading across glass. Because silence meant one thing. Silence meant arrival. Silence meant a figure was no longer waiting in doorways. Silence meant it had stepped through. The concrete beneath his feet trembled, softly at first like a distant truck rumbling past. But then the tremors deepened, pulsing in slow, nauseating waves that crawled up his legs and coiled around his spine. He lifted his eyes to the far end of the garage. Shadows. Convulsed. Not moved. Not swayed. Convulsed. The dark stretched outward, spilling across pillars and walls as though reality itself were tearing open. The silhouette materialized from the center of that distortion, tall and impossibly thin, its faceless head tilting in jerky increments as if snapping into place frame by frame. His breath hitched. The figure had stepped inside the world. It didn't walk. It didn't glide. It jerked. Limbs bending at angles no joints should allow, and each motion sharp and insect-like, abrupt freezes followed by rapid lurches. The figure moved toward him, one impossible flicker at a time. Ethan stumbled backward, nearly falling over a curb barrier. His pulse thrashed violently. His hands gripped the cold cement as though he could anchor him to reality. The walls of the garage pulsed, expanding, contracting, as though matching the breathing rhythm of something enormous beneath the structure. Dust rained from the ceiling beams. The entire building trembled like a living thing. Ethan whispered again, voice cracking. "The silence is your only warning." This time, the words didn't even carry half a foot from his mouth. Sound had no space here anymore. The figure flickered closer. One moment, it stood at the far wall. The next, halfway across the floor. The next, its elongated silhouette stretched across the concrete like a shadow being pulled taut. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, shaking violently. But the silence did not break. And he knew it was already too late. He ran. His legs nearly buckled with the first step, but adrenaline pushed him forward. His shoes slapped the concrete, except they didn't. He felt the impact. He saw the motion, but he heard nothing. His footsteps made no sound. His breath made no sound. His scream made no sound. He was sprinting through a manufactured void. Behind him, the figure flickered in pursuit, appearing at irregular intervals, its jittering movements impossibly fast, jerking closer in bursts. Its limbs dragged across the concrete silently, bending outward before snapping inward again. The silence deepened, thickened, swallowing everything except the raw terror pounding inside Ethan's skull. He reached a stairwell door and yanked it open. The hinges didn't squeal. The metal didn't clank. The door swung silently. He bolted down the stairwell. Every muscle burned. His lungs heaved. His throat tore itself raw, but none of it made a single sound. Only one thing broke the silence.
The figure's arrival. Not footsteps, not breathing, not whispering, just abrupt presence. It flickered into the stairwell landing below him, head twisting in a violent, insect-like jerk. Its faceless gaze lifted toward him, body contorting into a shape that suggested it could easily crawl, climb, or stretch to reach him. Ethan turned and ran the opposite direction, tripping down the stairs, crashing into the railing. No sound. The silence consumed his struggle, devoured his panic, swallowed him whole. He burst out into the night air, but the silence followed. Even the city, once full of engines, voices, distant hums, had gone mute. The world itself was suffocating beneath the figure's presence. At the edge of the parking lot, Ethan collapsed onto the pavement. His chest spasmed in agony, breath ragged, tears streaking hot down his cheeks. He couldn't outrun this thing. He couldn't escape the doorways. He couldn't outrun silence. But he could record. If not for himself, then for whoever found this place after him. His shaking fingers grabbed his phone. The screen flickered back to life, distorted and glitching as though struggling under the weight of the figure's presence. He pressed record. The phone vibrated without emitting any sound. The microphone registered nothing. But Ethan spoke anyway. This is my last night," he whispered, though he even couldn't hear the words. "The silence means he's here. The silence is your only warning." Behind him, a shadow stretched across the pavement. Long, tall, reaching. He didn't turn. He stared into the phone, into the last reflection he might ever see. He whispered, "He steps through when you stop listening. He moves when the world stops breathing. And once you know about him..." He swallowed hard, tears trembling at his jaw. "You've already invited him." A flicker of darkness fell over him. No sound. No breath. No world. Only the figure leaning down, its form bending at grotesque angles as the silence thickened into a physical force, pressing him. His final whisper, barely forming in the vacuum, escaped his lips. "The silence is your only warning." The screen went black, and the recording ended.
If you've made it this far, you understand the truth. He doesn't haunt houses. He haunts people. He finds the ones who listen, the ones who stay awake too long, the ones who dare to look into darkened doorways and wonder what's waiting there. Every detail I shared, every breath, every whisper, every step was a map, not to escape him, but to recognize him. Because now you've heard his name, felt his rhythm, pictured his silhouette standing quietly in my doorway. And that's all he needs. Awareness, attention, a single crack in your certainty. Tonight, when the clock hits 3:12 a.m., don't look at your doorway. Don't breathe too loud. Don't move. And if you hear floorboards creak, if you feel the air shift, if you sense someone watching you, remember this story and understand that he has finally found you. If you want the next story, survive the night first.